In this video, we are going to talk about the concepts in lesson 3.5, all about methods and how to. For starters, if you recall, when we talked about object-oriented programming, we talked about how there are three main classes or parts of our class. For starters, we have our instance variables, and those hold the attributes or values for each object. So these are things like name, age, ID, etc. We also have constructors, and constructors, their main job is to initialize or to set up these instance variables so that they're ready to be used. Recall that if we don't have a constructor, Java will give us a default, no argument constructor that sets all those instance variables to their defaults, 0, 0.0, and null. And then lastly, we also have our methods, and these methods have all of the code for the behaviors of an object. So we talked about how things like name, age, ID are all attributes. Well, methods for those behaviors might be, for example, get age or have a birthday or something like that. And these methods are able to access those instance variables that are defined for the class. What we're going to be focusing on today are writing those methods. So what is an instance method? How is this different from just any other method? Well, what makes an instance method different is that it is defined within the body of your class code. So if you think about this, we'd have like our class code, our public, we would have public class, and let's say we just had a student class, which is a really common example. And then inside this student class, first, we're going to see all of those private instance variables. Then after that, we will see any constructors that we need. And then that's where we'll start having our methods. Notice that these methods, constructors, and variables, they are all inside the body. And so when I say inside the body, I mean like everything that is inside of those main curly braces for the class. And so as long as it's defined in there, then it can see and access the variables and everything knows everything else. So remember, in order to call an instance method, we have to first have an object. So when we create an object, we're going to do that with this notation. So the class name, object name equals new class. If I were trying to make a new student, I would say, for example, student Mike equals new student, and then I would pass in whatever was needed for the constructor. Now, if I wanted to call a method on Mike, such as print schedule, the way that I do that is I need to have the object call the method. And so that would look like this. I would say Mike dot, and then I could say print schedule, and that would call a method of the object. Now, one of the things we've talked about quite a bit is the idea of void versus non-void. So recall that a void method is a method that does not return anything. So this is used when we want to just simply perform an action. Sometimes we print, sometimes we don't. But the key thing is we do not need to return. Now our other option is going to be a non-void method. And a non-void method is going to be a method that returns a single value. So we have to have a return statement. Usually it's at the end, but not always. And this return statement is going to return either the value of a variable, or it could return an expression, or just a straight up number, word true, or something like that. Within the header, we have to include the return type. So this is how Java knows what value it can expect to be sent after that method. And we use this instead of using the word void. And as soon as that return statement is encountered, the method will return to where it was called. So let's say we were in our main method and we called another method. We would leave control of the main and go into that method. And then if something happened inside the method that made us return early, we would immediately return and go right back to main where we left. There are two special types of methods. One is called accessor or get methods, and the other is called our mutator or set methods. So let's just recap these methods just to make sure we remember all the basics. So recall that those instance variables are supposed to be private to the class, meaning that only the class has direct access. For code outside the class, if we want to be able to access the value, we have to write what is often called an accessor method, or more commonly called a getter method. And this method is going to be of the form get variable name. Now, it's important that we make sure that our getters are public and takes no arguments and only returns the value of that private instance. Remember, its only purpose is to get that value. So all it is supposed to do is just say return whatever. And the body of this method is simply just returning that variable. Now, on the other hand, we also have our mutator or our set methods. And these are, you can think of them like a complement to our getters. This is so that code outside of the class, so recall those curly braces we drew a few slides ago, this is referring to code that is in a different .java file, completely outside of the class. If we want something outside of the class to be able to update the value of this private instance variable, we have to create a mutator method. Now, these methods are usually called setters. The reason why we specify the difference between mutator and setter is that in mutator, this is technically any, oops, let me see there. Now you can't see my eye. Oh well, this is technically any method that changes the value. I just can't spell. Just imagine all those letters are in. This is any method that changes the value of an instance. So let's talk about the difference between. So let's say, for example, I had this student and maybe I had a method that calculated the GPA. And so yes, it is going to end up changing a value of a variable, but before it can change the value, it has to do so. That would be an example of a mutator method. On the other hand, I might have a method that simply changes the address of the student, and it might be called set address or set street. And in that case, it is simply replacing the value. So since its only task is to replace or update a value, that would just be called straight up setter. And in that case, we call them set variable. If the method is doing additional work along with changing a value, then we call those mutators. So here's a good visual to help us see the difference between these. So notice that the type of variable that we're working with when we're dealing with a setter is going to be my parameter type. And when we're dealing with a getter, it's going to be my return type. Also notice that they both have the set and get naming convention. And with that, we have the variable name that is part of it. And then you'll notice in my setter, I am saying that that variable name is equal to whatever that new value is. And in my getter is saying return that. Also notice up here, we're seeing those Java doc comments that we talked about with the @return or the @. Now, the last thing for us to talk about today is what happens when we pass parameters into methods. And we're going to really dive into this deep next, but for today, let's just get a quick overview. So when a parameter is a primitive value, and recall those primitives are int, double, Boolean, also a char. When we're dealing with a primitive value, what's going to happen is that the parameter is initialized with a copy of the value. So think how this is like when you copy my Google Doc. You start out with the same document that I have, and then you make your own copy of it. And as you change it, that does not affect my document at all. Okay, so changes to the parameter do not affect the original argument. Okay, now on the other hand, when my parameter happens to be a reference value, now you might be saying, okay, what do we mean by a reference value? Well, that would be like a student. Okay, so let's say I pass an entire student to a method. When that happens, what we see is that the parameter is initialized with a copy of the reference. Okay, so you might think, well, how is that any different? Well, recall that the reference is really the address of where that object is in memory. So this is kind of like making a copy of the key to your car or your house. Okay, if you give somebody that key, they can open the door. They have full access just like you do. And it's not like they're copying your car or copying your house, they are copying their access to your car. So when we make changes to the parameter within the method, this will affect the corresponding arguments, okay? Just like how if you made a copy of your house key and you gave it to your friend and they came over and made a huge mess, when you got home, you would still see a mess, okay? And we're going to talk about this more on Monday and Tuesday in our next few lessons. All right, that is it. Good luck. Our homework today is AP Classroom, and I will see you all Monday. Have a wonderful, safe weekend.